Everyone, it's our great honor to host the Honorable Jason Greenblatt. Served as Chief Middle East Negotiator for the United States of America for 3 years. Very close to President Trump. He achieved monumental things in the Middle East in that capacity, and not all of which is even known. I certainly don't know all of it, but even the things that I do know are so much more. Even the things that I do know that are in the public domain are not focused on sufficiently, and I'm not going to enumerate all of them, but just some of the major ones, at least for me. Firstly, Jason, I think, is probably more responsible than almost anyone else, with the exception of President Trump, for a new relationship between Israel and the Gulf states, where so much of the hostility has been ramped down, and maybe there's even a possibility for non-aggression treaties, and who knows, maybe one day exchange of ambassadors, who knows, greater economic development. He was the main bridge there. Of course, he played a key role in the moving of the embassy, along with Ambassador David Friedman and Secretary Pompeo, and of course the president, and of course Jared Kushner. But Jason was an integral part of that team, and that was historic. That was 2 years ago. We just commemorated the second anniversary. Played a key role as part of the peace team in the United States recognition of Israel's sovereignty of the Golan Heights. A key role in making sure that organizations like Hamas did not get UN funding, let alone US funding. It's a terrorist organization. But more than anything else, Jason, what I want to credit you with is the moral clarity that you brought in your time as chief negotiator to the Arab-Israeli conflict. You always recognized the humanity, the rights of the Palestinian people. First and foremost, as God's children, because you're a religious man, and secondly, of course, as an entity, as a people. But you also respected them enough to have certain standards, that there shouldn't just be regular excuses of conduct like financing terrorism, paid for slave policies. That was something really new that we had not really seen in the chief Middle East negotiator position.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. I've enjoyed the many Q&As we did together during my time at the White House. So I'm glad to be here. Let's jump right into the moral clarity issue, because actually, now that the issue of what people refer to as annexation and the July 1st date are in the topic of conversations, it's becoming more and more important, because you see the pushback that we're getting. And I always viewed what people call settlements, and I call towns and cities and neighborhoods, what I call Judea Samaria, what others call the West Bank, what some call occupied territory, and what should never ever be called occupied Palestinian territory, because that's just a complete falsity. They're using that as a straw man for why there won't be peace. You hear it from the Europeans. I believe I've heard it from former Vice President Joe Biden, where they speak as if Israel moves forward with annexation in some part or in accordance with the Trump vision, that is what's holding up a peaceful solution to the conflict. And really, that's nonsense. The notion that they would say that without even speaking about the many other significant issues to the conflict, let's just take an easy one, Gaza, right? Even if the two sides, when I say the two sides, I mean President Abbas in Ramallah and the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, were actually going to sit at a table together and discuss the Trump peace plan. Nobody remembers or thinks about or talks about the 2 million Palestinians who are suffering in Gaza under the iron fist of the Iran-funded terrorist organization, who are subjugating the Palestinians in Gaza, who are lobbing rockets and other harmful weapons over the border with Israel, who for a period of time were trying to rush the border with Israel, who have terror tunnels, who are horribly and unfairly holding two IDF soldiers who had been killed in action, and 2 Israeli civilians. And nobody speaks about that. They're just so hyper-focused on what they call settlements and annexation, as if that is the key to solving this conflict. It's not. It shouldn't be spoken about that way. If you want to discuss whether it's an issue or not, of course, I understand that it's an issue potentially for some, but you have to tell both sides of the story. And let's focus on some of the real issues, including terrorism and what you alluded to earlier, the Taylor Force Act, the funding by the Palestinian Authority of terrorists to kill and to harm Israelis and others. That is really what's preventing peace.
Well, in my opinion, look, we're good friends, and obviously there's a certain degree of subjectivity when it comes to friendship. But I also know you in an objective capacity, meaning as someone who studies the Middle East, tries to analyze the Middle East, and has met many of the decision makers who deal with U.S. Israel and U.S. Middle East policy. I actually think you have been the most successful Middle East envoy of the United States. So many of the others talked a big game. Of course, no one brought peace. Whether it was Dennis Ross, whether it was Martin Indyk, good men with good intentions. But they always went through the same playbook, which was that if we only stop the building of settlements, and which you just repudiated, that's not the issue. They never brought that moral clarity. You were the first to actually create a major breakthrough between Israel and the Gulf states. That is critical, not only because the Palestinians rely on so much aid, financial aid from the Gulf states, but because countries like Saudi Arabia are seen as the standard bearers of Islam, or Egypt, of course. You made so much progress. So I see you as an unsung hero, meaning you're a man of humility and you're unassuming and you never look to draw a lot of attention to yourself. But I think that you were America's most successful Middle East envoy who has actual, real, tangible results. You marginalized Hamas when that was not marginalized during the Obama administration. You cut off funding where things like UNRWA were not helping the Palestinians. They were leading to a dependency and a certain and an absence of moral condemnation when funds were being used for incitement in places like schools, et cetera. And there was a great moral clarity. And let me just say, it's not that you ever favored Israel. You favored values, American-style values that the United States expects Israel to uphold, Palestinian Authority to uphold. I mean, we wish Hamas, but that's an impossibility. And I saw you as someone who was trying to transmit American values and not just excuse the kind of behavior, which is not good for the Palestinians, certainly not good for Israel, that there were standards you were seeking to uphold, because that's the only real possibility for peace, is it not?
Yeah, and let me touch on two things. Look, I spent time with Martin Indyk, and I spent time with Dennis Ross and lots of other people who, in my view, were incredibly generous with their time to explain to us their view of how they saw the conflict and the potential resolution. I think it's no secret that Martin and I think differently about this conflict, but I was always grateful for his time. And Dennis and I probably overlap a little bit more than I do with Martin. I probably spent a little bit more time with Dennis, and I was always grateful for his insight. And it was very important to us to meet people like Martin and Dennis, Dory Gold, David Makovsky, so many other people who have been involved in this file over the years, because the only way we could actually think of a solution is to hear everybody's viewpoint. And that goes not only true with the peace process, those who are involved in the peace process on the American side, but we spoke at length to the Palestinian side, to the Israelis, obviously, to most of the countries in the region, to the Europeans, and we gathered a lot of information. We took some heat in 2017 and a lot of 2018 because people felt that we were taking too long. But we really felt that we needed a great deal of time to hear from everybody, learn everybody's positions before we started coming up with the solutions ourselves. But the most important thing to me is that we try to come up with a solution, not that is better for Israel, but that is better for both sides, one that's realistic, one that both sides could stand to gain from tremendously. I always say that if the Palestinians were to engage on this plan and actually reach the finish line, they can create something that is as successful as Israel has managed to create. Now, Israel had to create it under threats of terrorism and throughout wars and through isolation. The Palestinians, if this deal were to happen, the Palestinians would have a massive checkbook to create something incredibly successful, not only no resistance, but incredible support from the world community. So I think it's unfortunate that not only are they not engaging, they're heading in the opposite direction. And I'm sure it'll be on the list of questions, so I'll wait until you get there. But we should, at some point during this talk about President Abbas's remarks yesterday.
I want to first go to some comments that were, we'll begin domestically and then we'll move abroad. Let's just look for a moment at President Trump and Joe Biden. Biden has not yet been officially determined to be President Trump's opponent as a Democratic nominee, but of course he's the presumptive nominee. And he did a fundraising call yesterday with a group of Jewish donors. It was widely reported. I did not participate in that call, so these are all secondhand media reports. But there were two things of interest that Biden said that I'd like you to comment on, please. The first is he condemned President Trump for not sufficiently opposing anti-Semitism in its rise, even here in the United States. Now, I ask you this because after the worst anti-Semitic attack, maybe in American history, in Pittsburgh 2 years ago, 11 Jews murdered, you were the one that President turned to comfort the community. Even though you had the Middle East portfolio, you went there personally. I remember at the time. Then the president went. He was accompanied by the Israeli ambassador, our dear friend Ron Dermer. And I thought that the president could not have been more condemnatory. I thought the president could not have been more solicitous of Jewish feeling and sensitive to Jewish grief. And when you see a president who has Jewish grandchildren, and you're close to Jared, and all the things that have happened in the White House, including so many overtly observant Jews who now serve on the vice president's staff, the president's staff, and it has no precedent in American history. And I'm not saying this to even condemn Biden. I genuinely want to hear, now that you're out of the administration, how does that make you feel when you hear people like Joe Biden condemning the president for not sufficiently tackling anti-Semitism?
I didn't hear his comments. I actually didn't see them reported. So I'll answer when, as if I'm answering for anybody who makes that kind of statement, whether it was Joe Biden or anybody else, because I've heard it from leaders like Joe Biden and I've heard it from ordinary people. I guess I have 4 words: pure propaganda, pure rubbish. Maybe I'll add another 2, pure political. I deal in facts. I deal in personal experience. I'm a man who, as you know, worked for President Trump for 23 years, very closely. Our offices were 2 doors apart. I lived and breathed the Trump organization. And all I saw out of him and his family, by the way, but we're talking about the president, was deep respect for me being an observant Jew, deep respect for the Jewish faith, deep respect for when I had to take off for holidays in the middle of large transactions. If you want to talk about his actions while he was president, he ripped up the Iran deal, which was an existential threat to the state of Israel, not just the state of Israel, of course, the entire region, but what could be more important to the Jewish people than the safety and security of the Jewish state of Israel? Let's look to last year, 2018's speech in Congress. Was there ever a president in a State of the Union who ever spoke so eloquently, so frequently during the course of the speech, so beautifully, so warmly about the Jewish people? He condemns anti-Semitism. Let's talk about the executive order that he signed in December at the Hanukkah party, which will help our young children. I have 3 in college. Thankfully, none of them face this anti-Semitism, but there are so many of our young college students who are facing tough times on campus. So he signed an executive order that's going to help them battle that. Time and time again, he has stood by the Jewish people. He has stood by the state of Israel. People try to lay anti-Semitism at his feet. That is an absurdity. And I take it personally just because I've had the 23 years of experience with him as both a friend, a supporter of Jews, and I think that people ought to stop using that as a political card.
Well, all we have to do really is look at the people of Israel. When President Obama was president, I think that President Obama had a 4% approval rating, actual 4% approval rating among the citizens of Israel. And President Trump has said many times that if he went head-to-head against Netanyahu in an election, if he was an Israeli citizen, he might even defeat Netanyahu. He has like a 90% approval rating. So that's how the Israelis see him.
Maybe there'll be only one election in Israel then.
Well, they're finally at the end of the election cycle.
Yes, we should congratulate them. It's a big achievement.
There's now like an election process in Israel. We'll come to the conclusion. Okay, just another thing on that note, and then we'll move on. Biden also spoke about, he spoke about things that directly impact on the work that you did. He said that he would not move the embassy back. Not that I believe, when Biden said that, when he was asked about it, I was kind of surprised because remember, it was never, President Trump enacted a congressional law in moving the embassy because in 1994, the US Congress passed a bill. It's just that it gave the president a waiver, a national security waiver. President Trump was the first president, even amidst really great friends of the state of Israel, like George W. Bush, not to waive that presidential waiver and to move the embassy. And it's almost like, I'm not sure that, I'm sure Biden kind of knows that, but he didn't say that. And I was kind of surprised at that. He makes it sound like it's his prerogative to move the embassy back. His answer really should have been, that, sorry, this is a congressional law. This has nothing to do with Democrats and Republicans. This was almost universally passed by the House of Representatives and by the Senate. But the President Trump was the one who did it. He said he wouldn't move it back. Were you surprised at lack of enthusiasm on Biden's part? Like, instead of saying, I'm actually, here's an area where I'm in total agreement with Donald Trump in the moving of the embassy?
Well, I was certainly surprised because at some point he had supported it. It was a bipartisan act of Congress, overwhelmingly supported, not only when it was passed in '95, but by various resolutions throughout the years. So that's quite a flip-flop for him to do. But more importantly, I want to touch upon what you said earlier on in your question, because it's such an important point and people forget it. The law required the recognition of Jerusalem, the movement of the embassy, unless there was a national security waiver. I'm not going to criticize prior presidential candidates who later became president and disregarded their promise. I wasn't in the room when they did their analysis. I was only in the rooms, I should say, throughout the Trump process for the Jerusalem Act. But anybody who understands the law realizes that that can't be. What he said simply cannot be. He doesn't know the national security risk because he's not sitting there reading the intelligence reports that we were reading. He didn't go through the very extensive process that President Trump went through to make his decision, to make sure that he could honor the promise that he made. So the words escape me other than to think either he is completely unfamiliar with the law, or his advisors are completely unfamiliar with the law, or he was just saying something to score political points. But however you slice it, it's dead wrong. But I got to say, there were two other things that he said that are also dead wrong. Number one, he said he would automatically reopen, I don't know if he said automatically, he said he would reopen the PLO mission in Washington. We had no choice but to shut the PLO mission because we were following a different law, a law that required us to close it when President Abbas threatened to bring Israel to the ICC when he spoke at the United Nations. That required us to close it. The only way that it can be reopened, in my understanding, is that if the Palestinians come back to the negotiating table and negotiate peace in good faith. That doesn't mean they have to accept the Trump plan, but they do have to sit there and negotiate in good faith. If they don't do that, they're not entitled to have a PLO mission in Washington. So to make that kind of statement without delving into the law and explaining what the requirements are is mistaken. And the last one is he said he would reopen a mission to the Palestinians in Jerusalem, maybe he said East Jerusalem. Look, that one isn't necessarily a legal issue, but how does it serve the US taxpayer to have two missions in one city? We have an embassy in Jerusalem now, thanks to President Trump's bold and courageous and historic decision. That embassy has under its umbrella a Palestinian Affairs Unit. That Palestinian Affairs Unit is ready, willing, and able with much of the same staff to deal with the Palestinians because we should have a deep and important relationship with the Palestinians. But we don't have to pay a significant amount of money just to have a second mission to the Palestinians in Jerusalem. That's, in my mind, a waste of taxpayer money.
You once told me on that subject that when you were negotiating, serving as chief negotiator, and you would arrive in Israel, you would be driven by one suburban SUV when you were in Israel proper, and when you went to Jerusalem, into what people called at the time, disputed territories, you would have to be moved into a totally different car, new security service, et cetera, right? And all of this at an American taxpayer expense.
Yes, that was one of the flaws with the system, but it certainly had to be fixed once we moved the embassy, is that there were two full teams of different kinds of people, not the same number of people. Obviously, the embassy had a significant number of extra employees compared to the consulate, but there was a lot of oversight, a lot of overlap, which was a waste of money and would continue to be a waste of money. And I want to make sure my comments are not misconstrued. I believe that we should have US embassy staff that are dealing with the Palestinians from the leadership back to programming at the right time with ordinary Palestinians if we can get past this impasse. But it should be done in a way that makes sense, like everywhere else in the world, where the US taxpayer money is used properly and efficiently.
Jason, as good friends, I really think that I ought to frame what I believe to be the Greenblatt doctrine, that you have very significant achievements as our country's chief negotiator in 3 years that you served as such, which by the way, 3 years in the Middle East, measured in dog years, you're talking, it could feel like hundreds of years, those kinds of negotiations. But the Greenblatt doctrine for me was three things, and help me as I formulate this, I'd like you to comment. Number one, a recognition of real facts on the ground. You always emphasized, let's stop playing make-believe in the Middle East. That meant that how could we not have the embassy in Jerusalem when every world leader goes to Jerusalem? The Supreme Court is in Jerusalem, the Knesset is Jerusalem. That was one part of the Greenblatt doctrine. The second part of the Greenblatt doctrine was there has to be moral clarity on right and wrong. The United States can't always say that it's neutral when clearly Hamas is kind of a bloodthirsty death cult versus Israel, a democracy with whatever imperfections, but an American-style liberal democracy. And the third part of the Greenblatt doctrine for me was recognizing that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's stop making everything, let's stop pretending that, because it is a pretense, that everything is about Israel and the Palestinians. There was Israel and Saudi Arabia, there was Israel and the UAE, there was Israel and Egypt, and you broadened it. And in broadening it, that's how you can bring about a solution. I see that as the three prongs of the Greenblatt doctrine, which were very different to your predecessors. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I don't want to compare myself to my predecessors because I don't, although I know a lot about what they did, I can't say what their mantra was, but I think you've summarized it pretty well. Let's start in the reverse. When I started in the White House, there were so many people who used to call this the Middle East conflict, many still do, and the core conflict of the region. It is not the core conflict of the region. The notion that if you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all peace will break out throughout the area and there will be no more terrorism and there'll be no more war in the Middle East, it's utter nonsense. The conflict should be solved. It's an important conflict, but there are other conflicts in the region that have absolutely nothing to do with this conflict and will not be solved by fixing this conflict. So I think people should refer to it as you have, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli-Arab. I'm not even sure I would necessarily use the word conflict when it comes to Israeli-Arab, at least now that it's 3 years from when I started. There's clearly tension. I don't think that it will be resolved to a large degree without resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for lots of reasons. But I think in the 3 years under President Trump's leadership, and he gets credit and Prime Minister Netanyahu gets credit and all of the leaders in the region, MBS, MBZ, the Emir of Qatar, everybody gets credit for this. The connection between Israel and its Arab neighbors has grown to a much different degree than it ever was before. What was once under the table is now overt. Prime Minister Netanyahu visiting the late Sultan of Oman, who by the way was a wonderful man. I spent some time with him and my discussions with him were fascinating. Hatikva being sung in Abu Dhabi. Just recently, after I left the White House, they had a bike tour in the Emirates with an Israeli team participating. You had a Special Olympics being with an Israeli team in the Emirates. Last night, there was a flight that came from Abu Dhabi that landed in Tel Aviv, albeit to help Palestinians. It was all about Palestinian aid, but it shows the pragmatic nature of the Middle East today. They are willing to land in Israel because Israel is not their enemy. There's more to gain by working with Israel than there isn't, and they were happy to give the Palestinians aid through Israel. There was no problem. So that's how I would answer the third aspect of it. Going back to the first aspect, let's cut the nonsense, right? Let's talk real, let's talk frank. I want to read to you, I read this on an interview the other day because it's so important. If you don't mind, if you have just a minute. It's an article in, looks like it's a foreign policy website. Here's how they describe the Temple Mount. What the Muslims call Haram al-Sharif. The Haram al-Sharif site in Jerusalem Old City, which is home to Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex, is the third holiest site in Islam. That's true. No issue with that description. Known to Israelis as the Temple Mount, the site is a perennial source of tension. So while it's the third holiest site to Islam, it's just known to Israel as the Temple Mount, without any reference whatsoever to why it's known as the Temple Mount. The fact is that there were two temples there. The two Jewish temples from thousands of years ago stood there, were destroyed, and it is the holiest place to Jews, but that's completely absent from the description. It goes on to say a few other things, and it then speaks about how Jewish prayer is not allowed on the Temple Mount. They're restricted to the Western Wall, the holiest site where Jews can pray. Well, that's true too. But unfortunately, over the decades, so much has been relegated to the realm of the gray, the diplomatic, the let's just not talk about it because it'll be easier that way and maybe you'll get to a solution. I believe firmly that 70 years of that kind of talk, that kind of hiding the ball, that kind of unwillingness to be courageous to speak the truth has caused a big part of this problem. That doesn't mean that our way will fix the problem. There's now 70 years of this to undo, but certainly it's clear that doing that has not helped whatsoever. And all it's done is allowed people to manipulate and deceive and be unwilling to speak the truth.
So let's take that and go to a final part of Joe Biden's comments yesterday. And again, I don't say this politically. I'm contrasting the Trump foreign policy, where you were a key player, to what Biden is saying will be his foreign policy. He also said yesterday that he would oppose any kind of annexation. Now that Israel has a government, and it's a government of both right and left, it's the Likud and blue and white. And there's talk of Israel annexing it. And I don't know what Secretary Pompeo discussed last week in his 6-hour visit to Israel with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but apparently this also came up. And you physically wrote the Trump peace plan, where annexation of 30-odd% of Judea and Samaria is a big part of the plan. But Biden said he would not support it. Democrats already trying to circulate bills in Congress that could even penalize Israel financially if with withholding American financial aid if they annex. You want to comment on that as well? I mean, because annexation July 1st is something that might happen. I know that your colleague, Ambassador David Friedman, said to Israel, well, it shouldn't be done in isolation. It's got to be the whole plan. I'm not sure that Secretary Pompeo said that, by the way, because Pompeo keeps on saying it's Israel to decide, at least those are the comments that I read. But Biden is already saying, I'm opposed to this. Ain't going to happen under me. So then we saw another story that Ambassador Ron Dermer, and this is just something that I read, has been telling members of Congress, well, this needs to be done now because Biden was already saying he's going to oppose it. So I don't know if you want to comment on Biden's comments.
I think anyone who's opposed to it just doesn't understand the conflict well enough. First of all, let's talk about what they call settlement building, right? Nobody speaks about the fact that Palestinians build in these areas too. Now they build illegally, but they're building too. There has been a tremendous amount of construction on the Palestinians in areas of Judea and Samaria that are not considered under the Palestinian Authority. Why nobody talks about it, I'm honestly not sure. So it's again an example of one-sidedness. Do they want this land to stay in limbo forever? Do they want the Palestinians to be able to have a veto card forever, to say no to deal after deal after deal, to refuse to negotiate and engage and just leave Israel in limbo? The land is disputed. That is the only way that one could describe it. The land is, there may be a military occupation because somebody has to be taking care of the area, but there is no, it never was a Palestinian state. It never was Palestinian land. So when Israel is referred to as occupying it, it is because they're controlling it. The Palestinians need to sit down with the Israelis directly. The US can play a role, but the two sides have to sit down directly to work this out. But for anybody to say that the 67 borders are the borders that should apply, sometimes they say 67 borders plus or minus a few percentage points, that isn't reality. That isn't going to keep Israel safe. That isn't ever going to happen, in my opinion. What should happen is a negotiated solution. If you don't like the borders that we drew, by all means, please sit down and put forth other realistic borders. But what shouldn't happen is drawing a line in the sand and saying, you may not touch this land because that's what international law is. That's not true. International law does not say that the 67 borders are the borders of a Palestinian state. To be frank, we disagree with many countries on this. If you spoke to many in the European Union, and certainly many in the United Nations, they would say that. But they also say that East Jerusalem is supposed to be the capital of a Palestinian state. Well, I think you read the speech, Shmuley, of mine, but you know that with the full support of the US government, including the State Department, I spoke at the Security Council and said that the Palestinians' aspiration to East Jerusalem is not a right. We understand that Jerusalem is important to them. We would like to figure out whether there's a solution that could work. We think we did in our plan. If it's not good enough, by all means, let's talk about it. But to suggest that all of East Jerusalem, including the Old City, including the Jewish quarter, including the Temple Mount itself, is Palestinian or occupied Palestinian land, where does that come from? It comes from decades of people saying it without there being any basis in reality for it. Unfortunately, the Obama administration, or I should say the Obama-Biden administration, did leave us with that terrible resolution at the end of their stay in the White House, which in fact called Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, occupied territory. That's not a binding resolution, and I think it was completely outrageous for them to have done that.
Well, I always saw Joe Biden as a friend of the Jewish people, friend of Israel. Certainly when he was in the Senate, he always voted with Israel, very close to AIPAC. And I was kind of disappointed in his most recent comments. It just goes to show, unfortunately, that wherever his heart is, and I think his heart is one that is close to the Jewish people, it's the party, it's the drift of the party, and it's been a problem for a while, that extremist elements of the Democratic Party, especially when it comes to Israel, who for some reason embrace intersectionality, and you would really think that the most liberal elements of the Democratic Party, who believe in LGBT rights, who believe in women's rights, who believe in a free press, all of those things that modern liberalism champions, and which Israel champions, you would think that the intersectionality would be they would intersect with Israel. I find it astonishing, and this is just absolutely mystifying, that wing of the party has so turned against Israel. And I kind of fear that he's headed in that direction to mollify that wing. Remember, he hasn't even really won the nomination yet, but be that as it may, because Jason, you mentioned President Abbas, so let's now move to his comments. So President Abbas is now threatening that he's going to withdraw from any kind of agreement that he made with Israel. What that means, I don't know. He seems to make a lot of vague statements. I'm not even sure if he remembers everything that he's saying these days, because it seems to contradict itself on a regular basis. What do you make of President Abbas's comments?
He's said this many times. He threatened this many times. It's unclear to most, did he really mean it this time, or is it a threat? If he really meant it, let's talk about what the value is of a peace treaty. If you could just simply rip up the agreements that you sign and say, I'm walking away, what good is it? So that's why I think what we did with respect to our proposal, with respect to Israel's security, is of key importance, and I want people to understand that. We made sure to address the security issue of Israel in a way that would allow the Palestinians to keep stepping up to the plate as best as they possibly can, and maybe even perfectly. But we also took into consideration either they may not be able to, because Israel, unfortunately, has had 70 years of training to deal with terrorism and everything else that goes along with it. And the Palestinians may not come up to speed as fast or as completely as Israel has been able to do it. Number two, there could always be a regime change. This is a rough region. We never wanted Israel to be in the position that they handed something over and had to hope and pray that everything would work out okay. And if it didn't, lives would be lost. So we included a snapback concept, that if it turns out that the Palestinians did not do their job properly, then Israel could come in without being condemned at the United Nations and being condemned by everybody else, and do what they needed to do to protect its citizens to protect its citizens and keep them safe. Because that is the first and foremost job of the government. When you marry that with what President Abbas did yesterday, which is, if in the end he might sign a peace treaty and then 2, 4, 10 years later he abrogates the peace treaty, or somebody else abrogates the peace treaty, what good was that peace treaty? So we built in safeguards for exactly this scenario. It remains to be seen what happens, whether his remarks are real or not real. Every leader is stuck in politics sometimes. He's not any different, and I don't say that in a critical way. I hope he doesn't mean it, but statements like that are terribly unhelpful. And I'd love to hear what Joe Biden says about those statements instead of focusing on annexation. Or if you want to focus on annexation, where's the rest of your discussion on this topic?
Well, does Abbas mean that Oslo I and Oslo II are now abrogated? He gave no clarity. By the way, even if he didn't mean it, even if he was just like sounding off, it's incredible how irresponsible this is on the part of a leader to make that kind of statement. Even when Mohammed Morsi became the elected leader of Egypt before he was then cast out by the Egyptian people again, even he never abrogated the Camp David Accords. One of the first things he said was that he would abide by the Accords because he understood the importance of continuity in government. And even when Netanyahu became Prime Minister of Israel in 1996 for the first time, and he did not like the Oslo I or II agreements and didn't vote for them, condemned them, he still said that as Prime Minister, he would be bound by them because that's what a government has to do. Which leads me to kind of a final formal question, then I want to just ask you a few more personal things. Jason, I read the Trump peace plan, which you authored several times. I was actually amazed that you were able to condense so many painful decades of conflict into, it's about a 50-page document. Is that accurate? About 50 pages?
I think when I left, it was about 80, but they changed the font size. It might be about 60 now. I'm not sure.
So I was amazed, and it's very comprehensive, although it's that concise. It deals with so many issues. You and I have had several conversations about it. It certainly addresses Israel's security concerns, and it brings the three elements of the Greenblatt doctrine that I just mentioned. And by the way, I want you to remember that I'm the one that coined that, because when this becomes a thing in international diplomacy, and there's like books written about it decades from now, that I coined the Greenblatt. And as I said, it involves moral clarity in the Middle East. Number two, decentralizing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and saying, look, it's much wider than that, and hopefully getting better. And number three, a recognition of true facts on the ground instead of this pretend make-believe thing that really meant there was going to be no progress. But the one thing I wanted to ask you about in the plan is, you know that supporters of Israel, like myself, and people who support Israel because we believe in not just our Jewishness, Jewish identity, and our connection to our people, but also because Israel's a free democracy, because Israel's a human rights abiding democracy. We are very concerned about any entity calling itself a Palestinian state. I understand that this one is demilitarized, the one that you envision in the plan. It's demilitarized. It allows Israeli army patrols. It allows Israeli listening posts. So it's very different to Gaza, where Israel withdrew completely. And I understand that. And there's probably a lot more that I'm not even saying that gives Israel security guarantees, even amidst it being a Palestinian state. And I'm not even looking at objecting to a Palestinian entity called a state based on Israel not relinquishing land. I'm not looking at the question of whether the land belongs to the Jewish people in Israel on theological grounds that God gave it, etc. I'm looking at, just from if you don't mind for a moment, a popular cultural perspective for a moment. One of the most popular things on TV right now is Fauda. And I don't know, do you watch Fauda?
I love the show. I haven't started season 3 because my wife hasn't caught up yet. But it's a great show.
Yeah, I'm not going to give it away, other than to say, and I'm only saying this because AIPAC showed the first episode of Fauda at AIPAC this year, which you and I both attended just before COVID-19 broke out. And they brought the creators of the show on. And the creators of the show said, what we wanted to do in season 3 is focus on Gaza. Before, we focused on the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and the unique challenges of the Shabak, of the Israeli security services there, and but now Gaza. And the main thing that you see in season 3, without giving anything away, is how much harder it is for Israel to operate in Gaza, because it doesn't have any of the army bases, et cetera, that it has in Judea and Samaria. So from the show alone, it just seems that no matter how much we would like to say that something calling itself a Palestinian state could be demilitarized, et cetera, how does that stop terror tunnels? How does that stop, everything else that has happened in Gaza? And let me just say this. I don't ask this question as an indictment. You have served your country, the United States of America, so nobly. You served the most pro-Israel president in American history, Donald Trump, so nobly. You're a man of incredible decency and humility. I wish that you were actually slightly less humble. I actually wish that you took a bit more credit for the incredible achievements you had as our chief negotiator for 3 years. But this is one genuine concern that I have, that no matter what safeguards you want to put into your plan for terror tunnels not coming in, for Israel not being able to operate against terror cells because it doesn't have the infrastructure, military infrastructure that it has now, is that a concern for you?
Look, we thought long and hard about it, but I would say the answer is no. But I don't use the phrase two-state solution, and I don't use the term Palestinian state without referring to the roughly 60 or 80 pages of the political plan and what may be, I hope one day, a full-blown peace treaty. We were careful not to use the phrase two-state solution throughout the campaign and the presidency, other than 1 or 2 references. I think 2 references where President Trump mentioned it, because you cannot possibly solve or describe the enormous complexity of this conflict with those 3 words. I would say the way we wrote and spoke about a Palestinian state in the plan was a realistic Palestinian state, subject to all of the terms and conditions that are contained in this 80 pages, right? And in those 80 pages, you will find all the answers to the very, very valid concerns that you raise, but also the answers to the Palestinian desire to rule their own lives and have as real a state, if not a perfect state, as they possibly can, as long as they have responsible leadership running their state for all time. If they do that, the sky's the limit for them. If they don't do that, if for whatever reason President Abbas is not able or willing to do it, or Hamas takes hold, or whatever the many, many problems that we could easily foresee based on history, or we will never foresee just based on the fact that we can never do that. Nobody can foresee what can happen down the road. Then they won't have it. And that's why we left Israel with the controls that they need to make sure that any such state would either be a good neighbor, or if they're not a good neighbor, Israel would have the tools through which they could handle the issues themselves. But the last thing Israel wants is to have to deal with this, right? Israel would like to just, enjoy their lives like everybody in the world wants to enjoy their lives. They don't want to be going into Gaza or what might be a Palestinian state and having to do what they do and having to do what they did for decades. They want to love their children and enjoy their children and their families and their businesses and their beaches and everything else. And they want the same for the Palestinians. But they have to watch themselves. And in order for them to watch themselves, they have to be sure that either a Palestinian state is going to be true to their word and run properly and safely to protect both sides. Or if they don't, then the Israelis will have no choice but to go back in and protect themselves.
Well, we'll see what happens with the plan. I watched you as chief Middle East negotiator for all the 3 years. We did many public events together. I watched how you listened to all the parties, which I think was the most impressive thing that you did, really absorbing, not seeking to impose and that's why I think you ended up making more progress than all of your predecessors, which leads me to my final, as I said, it would be a personal question. And by the way, I know that you're an excellent father, so now's where guilt begins to kick in, and I don't want to take away from your family. I know one of the things that I most respect about you, Jason, is what an involved father you are and how hard it was in your years at the White House to be, you were doing that commute of spending the weekdays in Washington and some of the weekends back home for the Sabbath with your family, or some of them not. And I respect so much your commitment to the people of the United States and how you served us so faithfully. Do you miss it? Do you miss being in the administration? It's obviously taken this left turn with COVID-19. No one expected it, but do you miss it, or do you enjoy civilian life?
Look, I was honored and blessed to serve. It was such an incredible role, doing such amazing work with amazing people, both here and throughout the Middle East. I enjoy being home. I missed my wife and my kids. Thank God we're all healthy. So the COVID crisis for us, as tragic as it is in so many ways and as complicated as it is, I've gotten to sort of catch up on life with my wife and kids now for over 2 months. I think we've been on lockdown. I don't think I've ever in my career had family dinners during the week. We're always together Friday night, obviously, and Shabbat. I have dinner with my family every single night, which is an amazing thing. It would be amazing if I didn't miss them for 3 years, but it's amazing, especially having missed them for 3 years. At the beginning, I was having breakfast with my wife every morning. Now, because of COVID, we're busier than ever for so many different reasons. We don't get to have so much breakfast together, but I'm glad to be home, and I'm still dedicated to the mission. Somebody once told me it's like the Eagles song, Hotel California. You could check out anytime you like, but you never leave. I'm still dedicated to the mission. I still speak with people throughout the Middle East, not just on venture capital and high tech and all the things I'm not currently involved in, but I spend a great deal of my weekdays speaking about peace efforts, improving Palestinian lives, connecting Israel and the Gulf, not just for business reasons, but to continue to build on the building blocks of the past. So I'm able to do it, but not be separated from my family.
And to talk about some of your projects, you're involved with Our Crowd, which is the largest Israeli crowdfunding platform for Israeli high tech. Is that correct? Did I say that?
Yeah. John Medved is the founder. I'm a partner there. I joined at the end of February, and it's quite exciting. They're working on a number of really cool and exciting technology projects, including several around the pandemic issue, because they want technology to solve not only the COVID crisis, but whether there's a reoccurrence of the COVID crisis or the next pandemic or the next catastrophe, the world was caught by by surprise, right? And we all adapted quickly, some better than others, but I give everybody a lot of credit for getting us through this despite the economic devastation and of course the health concerns. But we shouldn't be caught by this kind of surprise again. So John is working on some really, really interesting things. I'm also I'm an advisor to a company called Windward, which is a maritime security company, which is really important in the region, in particular in the oil industry, sanctions and things like that. A really talented group of people there. I'm an advisor to an energy storage company called Zeta, who are developing a battery that is supposed to be, really, really exciting. So I'm involved in quite a number of things. And I would say the nexus between them, besides technology, is a lot of people are interested in tying Israel to the Arab countries. And there's a lot of interest on both sides. We'll see what happens. I'm patient enough and trained as a diplomat, so I understand these things will take time. But historically speaking, if we don't try it now, after all these dramatic changes and oil prices being what they are, so the region has to move in a different direction, and the young population thirsting for a better future. Shame on us if we don't try it. So I'm really excited about that.
Jason, let me thank you for being with us this evening, taking time from your family. Even if you have been on lockdown for 2 months, I know that you cherish every moment with them, especially after having been absent for 3 years. But I also want to take this opportunity publicly to thank you for the friendship you've always shown me and the World Values Network and the amount of briefings that you gave us. What I believe more than anything else, what all this means, yarmulke, beard, being a rabbi, is that first and foremost, my actions have to lend dignity to the sanctification of God's name, to what we Jews call the Kiddush Hashem. That because people know that I call myself a rabbi, that my actions have to reflect that a belief in God actually ennobles my character in some way and makes me think before I act that I represent something larger than myself. And in the time that you served as our foremost diplomat to the Middle East, the world's most troubled region, I believe sincerely that you represented the United States with phenomenal dignity. That even when the Palestinians said things, or other parties that were unkind, you responded only with maturity. That all of your social media posts back then and until today were always extremely well thought through. Even when you felt the need to condemn, you did it in a way that was reserved. I mean, very clear about what you believed, but it wasn't about harshness. It wasn't about provocation. It was about stating right and wrong. And I think all of us are in your debt. And I think that you brought the Middle East many steps forward. Even if we don't yet see a lot of those things yet. We see many of them, but we'll see more. And I want to thank you. And I can't wait for your book to come out, God willing, if you ever decide to write one. You should, because you had a seat at the table at some of the great events, and you continue to. And when and if you communicate with President Trump, who, as you said, is more than someone that you just worked for, he's a personal friend, you're colleagues of 23 years, I hope that you will please communicate to him in a non-political way, but in a very human way, the gratitude of the American Jewish community for everything he has done for Israel's safety and security and everything he has done to combat anti-Semitism. And the warmth and kinship he has shown Jewry in general, the state of Israel in particular, that has really no precedent in the annals of this great republic. So God bless you. And how do people find you online?
I'm at Twitter, Greenblatt JD. I'm on Facebook and on LinkedIn. So that's where I do all my writing these days. But thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for the conversation. It's always interesting, and I appreciate all of your warm and kind remarks. And it was really a great honor for me to serve our amazing country that has been so good to the Jewish people. So thank you again, and have a great night.
Thank you, Jason. God bless. Thank you.